Good afternoon, everyone. Jonathan McGee, Deputy Director for Regional Economic Development at the Illinois Department of Commerce. I am joined here by my colleague, Dennis, who is representing the EDA and who will be doing a presentation today. I'd like to start by thanking CMAP for coordinating and putting this webinar together as we talk about the new EDA CARES Economic Adjustment Assistance grant that is available. So thank you, Jane, thank you, Austin, and thank you everyone else at CMAP who helped to make this possible, and all of you all who are joining us. I did want to do a little housekeeping. Again, you're joined in this webinar as a listen-only mode. So any questions that you're going to have around this grant opportunity, please post them in the chat or the question box, and we will try to address those accordingly. The other piece of this is that this webinar will be recorded. So with that being said, we'll jump right in. I'll have Dennis introduce himself, and then he'll jump right in. So Dennis, if you want to take it away, introduce yourself.
Yeah, Jonathan, thank you so much. And I want to also, on behalf of EDA, thank you, CMAP and DCEO, for just offering this opportunity to discuss what EDA's programs are and how our agency can help with our response to the COVID pandemic. I have a lot of information about EDA generally in case any of you are unfamiliar with the agency, and then specifically around the CARES Act. So just some EDA background for you to begin with. The agency was formed, I don't want to give you all the EDA history, but essentially it was a Great Society program that was formed back in the 1960s, and the idea was economic development at that time was actually very young, just a sort of an outgrowth of urban planning. And the idea at that time was so much of land use planning and urban planning was being done on a municipal level or maybe on a county level. And the folks who started EDA said, we need to be thinking regionally. So often, and even to this day, I'll see community A, small community situated next to community B. They both think that they need the same infrastructure because for a variety of reasons, they want to feel like the ones that control their destiny, and that's an understandable circumstance. But with economic development and sort of a globalized economy, the idea is that we would all work together to become more competitive as a region. Economic activity doesn't stop at a county line or a municipal border. So central to EDA's mission is regionalism. How are we providing strategic assistance or implementation assistance to help communities and regions be as competitive as possible, together with the planning focus. So you find that even way back in the 1960s, EDA was saying, if we're going to do economic development, we have to have a strategic plan in place to be able to do that. That has evolved into what we think of as comprehensive economic development strategies. So in many rural areas and in some smaller metropolitan areas, we fund regional planning organizations, councils of government, other regional-based economic development organizations to do that comprehensive economic development strategy process. A lot of people think about strategies, it sits on the shelf, we look through it from time to time and make sure that it still makes sense. But it's actually a process. It starts with finding out where are we, understanding data and statistics about a given region situation, bringing in stakeholders and leadership to say, where do we want to go? So setting goals and objectives and things like that. And then how do we want to get there? That most difficult part. What sacrifices are we willing to make in one area to make another area more successful? Where do we make these choices as to infrastructure development? What are our true priorities in terms of the budget? So I think that informs you a little bit about where EDA comes from, and some of the things you'll hear today certainly will help you understand why the requirements or why we see that as so central to our mission and why we focus on those kinds of things. So if we could flip to the next slide. Specifically around the CARES Act, if you look again a little bit at EDA history here, our regular appropriation is typically around $250 million. We're a very small agency when you think about the entire federal budget, but $250 million every year. Some percentage of that goes to our partnership planning program. So I referenced earlier these regional planning organizations that do these economic development strategies for multi-county regions, some percentage of that goes to those folks on an ongoing basis. So we think of them as economic development districts. We've designated them as our economic development planning partners in those regions that they serve. We also have programs that run out of headquarters. So our Build to Scale, formerly known as the I-6 Challenge and Regional Innovation Strategies Challenge, that's actually a fairly small percentage of the funding. So much of what EDA funds comes through our 6 regional offices. In Chicago, we are responsible for the 6 Great Lakes states. We make grants sort of in partnership with applicants. It's a network of economic development representatives that we have at EDA. It goes out and talks to applicants about what is your vision, what is your strategy, what types of projects do you want to do. We have a program with rules. You have a vision for your type of project. Let's see if the two can meet. So it's very hands-on. It's not something where the agency says, here's the deadline for applications, send in your application, and we say yes or no and move on. Those decisions are made with conversations with the economic development representatives, and then grants officer, the regional director, makes the decisions on the vast majority of EDA's funding. What we've seen in the past, though, is when Congress sees an economic development need that is sudden and severe, or that something has happened in a region that requires an immediate response, not in the sense of, I'll use a natural disaster as an example, FEMA will be there to fill sandbags, to prevent any additional flooding or disaster impacts. EDA will follow along to say, community, region, how can you make yourself more resilient in the face of these ongoing disasters? Or how can you ensure that your economy is diversified when a major plant closes, the entire town doesn't have to fold up and go away? So you've seen the $250 million regular appropriation supplement in FY18 with an additional $600 million to deal with natural disasters. So the hurricane, wildfires, flooding in the Midwest, all those things we helped address, not, like I said, in that immediate response, but more along the lines of helping those communities prepare themselves for the impact of future disasters and diversification. When you look at plant closures, like in Lordstown, Ohio, or other major plants, DHL comes to mind a number of years ago in Ohio as well, EDA is there to say, what can we do to help this community recover? Do they need a new strategy to figure out where to go next in the absence of their employer? Do they need a recovery coordinator to help bring together all the stakeholders in the region, human services organizations, economic development organizations, business leadership, to say, this is what we should be doing in the face of this disaster? So that additional $600 million in FY18, another $600 million in FY19, also along the lines of those natural disasters. And the 6-state Chicago region got a significant part of that because of the flooding that occurred along the Mississippi River and in other places as well. Now, FY20 comes along, and of course we know the story of FY20. EDA received a $1.5 billion appropriation for the CARES Act. I want to break that down a little bit further, though, because if any of you are familiar with federal grants, the announcement that funding is available is always on grants.gov, and you can link to the information about CARES Act funding on our website as well, eda.gov. But the NOFO itself actually breaks down how that funding was distributed among the 6 regional offices. So in Chicago, we received $225 million to spend in our 6-state region, the 6 Great Lakes states. Now, I mentioned our partnership planning program, and so some significant part of that went to our partners to make sure that when they're doing economic development strategic planning, they're including reference to COVID and how we respond to that. So if you can imagine a rural area that says, well, we need to adjust our strategy to include a greater emphasis on broadband capacity because we have so many workers that are working at home, or we need to adjust our strategy to ensure that access to capital is provided to our downtown businesses, or in tourism heavy areas, we need to adjust our strategy to make sure that we understand what would happen in the future if a disruption in travel occurred. So that $225 million, some percentage of that went to those economic development district planning partners. Some percentage of it also went to recapitalization of our revolving loan fund grantees. So for any of you who are familiar with Axion Chicago, they are a revolving loan fund grantee of EDAs. We added some additional funding to our revolving loan fund partners, not just Axion, but across the country. And so taking that $225 million for our 6 states, reducing it by the amount for the partnership planning program, reducing it by the amount for our revolving loan fund grantees, and then some university center partners that we have, where we partner with universities to make sure that they're doing economic development, either technical assistance or research or applied sciences related to economic development. So to break it down, I think the 225 number can be a little bit misleading, because a fair percentage of that, maybe $100 million, went out the door as non-competitive grants for the planning partners and for the revolving loan funds. So competitively speaking, probably $100 million for our 6 states, $120 million for our 6 states. Certainly Illinois with its large population, certainly Illinois with its heavy impact from COVID is going to be well placed to access some of that funding, but it is a competitive program. And so we're looking for those applications right now to be able to fill up that $100 and some million dollar pipeline. And when we talk about the Economic Adjustment Assistance Program, I really don't find it instructive to think about federal agency specific program names. It's generally someone who came up with sort of a creative name, but it doesn't necessarily inform you as to what is going on in the program. But I do want to unpack that term, economic adjustment assistance, because of what it means for communities looking to access those funds. So if we could flip to the next slide. So if we think about the kinds of things that we can do under economic adjustment, and again, since the pandemic is a unique situation, I want to kind of characterize it in terms of other disasters that have occurred and other applications of this program. Where we have that major plant closure, we really need to be able to do everything that the agency is empowered to do under law to be able to help that community. Some disaster has struck, and now we need to be able to offer them any assistance that we could possibly offer. That's really what it means to be in that economic adjustment situation. Either there's some disaster that's happened, or some closure that's happened, or some change in the economic landscape has occurred, and now we're going to throw everything we have at it. Same thing in the case of a natural disaster. So many impacts in so many different ways, we need to offer anything that we can do. And here with COVID, we find that this CARES Act funding went through our Economic Adjustment Assistance Program. So as you can see in that second bullet point, reference to EDA investment in non-construction awards and construction awards. So non-construction awards, and you can see some examples down there. Non-construction awards would be recovery planning. For any of those places that don't have a strategy in place for economic development, I think it's important to understand that if you've been living so long without a strategy, these kinds of disruptions can catalyze planning efforts to say, we're in a new world and we didn't have a plan before, but we need one now. That is certainly something that we can help literally any eligible applicant with. And I think when we're talking about those strategies, we need to maintain a focus on job creation and private investment. So I think economic development is certainly a big term. Placemaking, infrastructure, business development, workforce development, community development. In various definitions, those all fit under economic development. We're a little bit more specific, not completely pigeonholed, but a little bit specific in the sense that when we look at these strategies, it's really to grow the economy. I think when you look at strategies that address human services, certainly people need to be healthy to go to work, but that's a little bit far afield for what we're looking for. Again, it goes back to, if you look strictly at the economy, economic activity, strategies that we want to help communities develop focus on where are we right now with respect to our economy, where do we want to go, and how do we want to get there to grow jobs and private investment. So some of the examples of that maybe I would offer would be if we have an industrial corridor and there's some open space that could be developed and we just don't know what to do with it, that's something that we could try to help understand, because that refers to that job creation piece. What infrastructure do we need here to help create economic activity on this vacant land? What workforce training programs do we need to ensure that current employers have a steady supply of skilled workers? What kinds of incentives can we offer? All those things go into a strategy to help people understand how to grow their economy, and we're certainly interested in helping develop that. I think when we look at other non-construction programs, other non-construction investments, we look at those recovery coordinators. So some community that has been dramatically affected by COVID in this instance, we could certainly look at how do we help that community coordinate all of its resources with respect to economic development and make sure that they are moving forward away from this disaster as quickly as they can and making the right choices to position themselves for future success. So the idea of someone there, typically our non-construction awards last anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, a little bit beyond 2 years, to be able to have someone stationed there in a place where there are dramatic effects from COVID and where they need help coordinating activity, or where they need a strategy and it's going to take a year to go through that process. Because again, I want to emphasize to everyone, I'm sure there are a lot of planners on the line today, it's not a document, it's a process that we do when we do strategic planning. So that's all, I think, interesting. I would also offer revolving loan funds. So I mentioned that we recapitalized our current revolving loan fund grantees. We're interested in doing new revolving loan funds, but a word of caution on that. When you look at revolving loan funds with the federal government, things can get very scary very fast. And the reporting requirements are oftentimes rigorous, because of course we're charged with protecting the federal interest in a sum of money that's being lent out to small businesses, and ensuring that that money is either paid back or written off, and that all the accounting is done accurately and all the underwriting is done with any amount of due diligence that would be required. So we really look for new revolving loan fund grantees who have experience in lending under other federal programs, or at least some experience in small business lending, to be able to make them competitive. Certainly, anyone is eligible to apply, but again, that conversation with the economic development representative usually focuses on competitiveness, and it's a challenging application process and something that we're willing to help competitive applicants navigate. But it's also a conversation to say, if you don't have experience in this area or your project just isn't going to be a fit, we're always speaking in the language of competitiveness, trying to help people understand whether they have a shot at this funding with their proposal or not. And like I said, that's a conversation before we ever get to the application. So when we think about revolving loan funds, I think that for the most competitive applications, they're going to be folks that have already been involved in small business lending and have a track record of success and successful responsiveness to reporting requirements and success in making loans that are repaid. That really covers our non-construction assistance, just in terms of examples of the types of projects that we try to fund. When we think about the types of projects that we fund under our construction assistance program, that really goes to that infrastructure, again, that serves job creation. So what does that look like? Well, it's to the exclusion of anything that refers to residential. So hard infrastructure is something that we're very familiar with. Roads, water, wastewater, water treatment plants, wastewater treatment plants, centers that provide workforce training. All of those things are things that we have funded with our Economic Adjustment Assistance Program and construction awards. And I think that they're most competitive where, again, they serve job creation needs. So in so much of Chicagoland, we see industrial activity in many smaller municipalities. It seems to transcend borders, but where you have an industrial park and maybe the road is now in such a state of disrepair that employers are threatening to leave. that could be a competitive proposal for EDA assistance. Maybe there's a water treatment plant that needs upgrades to serve a job creation kind of development or expansion within the city. So there's some vacant land, a new food processor moved in, and they're going to need additional water capacity to run their operation. That means the water treatment plant needs upgrades. That's certainly something that EDA can assist with. I think a couple notes of caution here, and I want to flip soon to eligible applicants, eligible activities, but when we look at construction assistance, anything that we pay for must be owned for the useful life of that infrastructure by an eligible applicant. So that means any entity that is not for profit and not an individual. So state and local governments, special purpose units of government, nonprofit 501Cs, anyone but a business or for-profit entity must own that infrastructure. And so that's easy when we're talking about water treatment plants. That's easy when we're talking about road, water, and sewer, usually. And it's usually easy with respect to workforce development centers, where you're going to have a place that has perhaps CNC machines that people can train on. You're going to have programs run out of there to help with any kind of innovative workforce training that needs to happen. That kind of thing is usually owned by those eligible applicants, but that will absolutely stop the conversation in its tracks. If we have any indication that the infrastructure is going to be owned by a for-profit, that just won't work for us. I also want to caution everybody that it's a long-term relationship with any of these things. So with the revolving loan fund especially, we make a grant to that nonprofit or unit of government, and now that money never loses its federal character. So we have some revolving loan funds. We made the grant back in the 1970s, and they're still with us, loaning that money out and being repaid and loaning it out again. But I think that when someone says, I'm in the middle of a pandemic, I know I have businesses that need access to capital, can we get a revolving loan fund? Certainly something that makes sense from an economic development standpoint, but for that entity, they need to step back and say, am I interested in being in the lending business forevermore? And I think for us, we're always assessing, again, going back to, do they have the capacity, or have they already made loans? Are they in the business of lending? To give us an idea of whether this is something that is just happening because of the pandemic, or if this is something that's truly going to be sustainable for years to come, and that this organization is going to be a good steward of the federal assistance. So that's all, kind of background on what is an example of a project EDA would fund. Typically, we are out there at the industrial park. We're helping those businesses that provide assistance helping those communities that need assistance for job creators and businesses that are out there in the industrial park, or providing, jobs that really allow us to, on a Friday night, spend time downtown. We very rarely get to community development projects. So when you think about a need to make my downtown more resilient in the face of this COVID disaster, because people were coming here before and now they're not, and so many of my retail downtown businesses are struggling, I need some park benches and planters and attractive streetlights to make my downtown more attractive. That's not a great fit for EDA just in terms of competitiveness, only because we think about our niche in economic development as, like I said, out there at the industrial park, giving people jobs that then they can use the salary that they get from that job to go downtown, maybe on a Friday night or something like that. I hope that helps kind of characterize just where EDA is in its philosophy around, our small place in the overall frame of economic development. If we could just advance the slide. Great. So talking about eligibility, I did mention eligibility, and like I said, I think the easiest way to think about it is anyone who is not a for-profit, not an individual, we can make grants to those organizations. And you can see the list down there at the bottom of the slide. I do want to talk about special need. So that actually refers to the grant rate. So everyone wants to say, well, if I have $1 million project, how much am I required to provide in local match or local share? What is my contribution? EDA almost every time, other than in the case of Native American tribes, requires some local share. Now, normally it's a 50-50 split, but for those places that have encountered dramatic distress, Flint, Michigan, perhaps Fresno, California, some other places that are in the news as places that are just in dire straits, we can elevate the grant rate. But with this CARES Act funding, we're able to elevate the grant rate for any eligible applicant because of the national eligibility as a special need related to COVID. So eligibility does not refer to competitiveness. And I think when we look at a very successful community, they're certainly eligible for a higher grant rate than 50%, but competitiveness is something that we determine based on a number of factors. And when you think about competitiveness for EDA assistance, our charge is to help distressed communities. So absent this special need created by the pandemic, by COVID, communities would typically have to have per capita income below 80% of the national average, or an unemployment rate at least 1% above the national average. So I think for all of you in successful communities, congratulations. But also I want you to be aware of EDA's mission to help distressed communities. All communities in America are distressed right now, but the way that we evaluate distress is not just, do you have eligibility? Here, everyone has eligibility, but are you distressed in other ways? Is there other indicia of economic distress, low per capita income, high unemployment, plant closures, natural disasters that have occurred recently? That gets us considering higher grant rates. And really, we're looking up to 80%. So I think for that community that's already eligible under EDA's regular programs, low per capita income, high unemployment, that's going to be probably an 80% grant rate. For those other communities that don't have typical indicia of distress, still eligible for EDA assistance. But I think when you're talking to me about what your ideas are, don't think to yourself, okay, I know I'm eligible for 80%. Think to yourself, how much can I contribute to this project to show my commitment, and how does that relate to the level of distress in my community? So I just always want to unpack eligibility and competitiveness. Just because you're eligible doesn't necessarily mean you're competitive. Now, I want to think about what we're trying to do with these projects as it relates to COVID. And I think that that's been difficult for us. You know, it's very, very natural for us to say in a typical circumstance, well, they have a need for industrial, developable industrial space in their region. They've demonstrated that they either have businesses that are interested in moving to that region, or businesses that are ready to expand, but for the availability of open space. That's pretty safe ground for us. We know what to do with that. In the case of natural disasters, where we see the need for diversification, the community says, all activity stopped in our industrial park because of flooding. We need to do something to create new space for businesses to locate or grow outside this flooding threat zone, or we need to make sure that the businesses that are already here are protected, that we can keep the lights on in the face of future disasters. That's also solid ground. But I think with COVID, it's very difficult because, number one, we haven't really assessed what the impact is, because the impacts are spread throughout the economy. I think if you look at that manufacturer that had a supplier overseas and now has not been able to access product from that supplier, they're affected by COVID. I think when you look at businesses that had sales to for example, activities that are typically going to happen in the summertime, they're going to sell patio umbrellas. Probably not a lot of people buying patio umbrellas right now, and so they're impacted. So drawing that connection between I have been impacted by COVID and businesses in my community or region have been impacted by COVID to I need this infrastructure or I need this non-construction assistance to help respond to that COVID impact. We're really looking for that. I think that when Congress made the law and passed the appropriation, they were very intent on making sure that EDA was not out there doing things that don't respond to the pandemic. And again, we're not going to be there responding to the pandemic in the sense that we're distributing face masks. We're going to be there to help communities figure out where to go next. We're going to be there to help communities make themselves as resilient as possible in the face of future disasters. And what that looks like is going to be very contextual. So for that community that's in, for example, Door County, Wisconsin, they're not going to have a lot of industrial activity, but their entire economy is centered around tourism. And so is there something that makes sense for EDA? Certainly not those park benches and streetlights, but something that makes sense for EDA to provide additional access to the downtown, turn lanes, things that will help people get downtown rather than beautification. I think in Chicagoland, though, so many communities have the kinds of things that EDA really feels comfortable with, that's where we're seeing the most competitive projects. We're certainly going to be oversubscribed for the $100 million that we have to spend in competitive grants. And I think that that's where our decisions have to really come down to those projects that are going to refer greatest to job creation. Now, I want to pause here and just answer some of these questions. And I see them in the question box. So let's just take a second and I'll respond to them as they've come in. I think the first one is, sorry with the audio issues. I hope everyone else, I noticed that someone responded. I hope everyone else is able to hear me. The next question was, I'm attending on behalf of a county entity, but we've been in conversation with regional economic bodies. Who would apply in that case? Our county, our region, etc. So we have a concept called co-applicancy. And in a construction context, it's very easy. Anyone who owns the infrastructure needs to be an applicant. But where we see, so for example, someone holds some rights to that infrastructure, but the other applicant will maintain it. So thinking about a road, the County Road Commission is responsible for maintaining the road. Maybe the city owns the road or something like that. We're going to bring them in as co-applicants. And that's an easy process to navigate. It's just a matter of trying to see who needs to be a co-applicant and who doesn't. Because applicancy and being a co-awardee comes with responsibilities. And so that's, again, part of that conversation. If you're interested in EDA assistance, we would talk and I would start to ask questions about who's going to own this, who's going to maintain it. I understand now these folks need to be co-applicants, and that's an easy process. Okay. Does it have to be owned by the unit requesting the funds? So a building owned by a nonprofit is leased by another for CNC training. Can the leasing entity apply? We're always very nervous about leases, only because they create some uncertainty about the EDA investment. So a lease that was for a term of 25 years for some infrastructure that we provided with a useful life of 20 years, I think we could get comfortable with that. But where the lease is, year to year or month to month, and we're pounding nails into the wall and we're moving around things that go into that building, we can't do that because we have no assurances that that entity that is eligible is going to use it for the entire useful life and not vacate the premises and go on with their program somewhere else. So I think ownership is something that we just take very seriously, very, very seriously. And when it comes to those kinds of questions, if there's any indication that our infrastructure is going to go into a building that will not be used for the purposes that were announced in the application, I think that creates a lot of uncertainty and is generally uncompetitive. So, for example, there's a for-profit entity that owns a building, and on one floor of the building, we have a nonprofit workforce training provider, and we're going to put in we're going to rearrange the walls in that floor, and we're going to put in some fixtures and change around the electrical and things like that. That's something where if there's a shorter lease than the useful life, we just can't do that. Where we have longer term leases, I'd certainly be interested in talking about that. But again, the emphasis is always on where we put infrastructure, wherever that sits, it's got to be owned, title and everything, by an eligible applicant. Okay. Next question. An advanced manufacturing center at a local community college qualify for EDA resilience funding? It certainly would, and I think that helps us get to, sort of the dollar range of what we're talking about. I think that's probably on everyone's mind. And I can tell you that the agency in its history has made grants of $25,000 all the way up to $30 million. I don't think that's particularly instructive because those are usually extreme examples, many standard deviations away from sort of the median project size. And I think that, for a non-construction award where we're doing a strategy, how much does a strategy cost? Well, it depends on how you're doing it. It could be a bunch of personnel that are already at the applicant's organization. Maybe some of that is going to be, maybe some of that work is going to be done by interns who are usually very, very low cost, all the way to, I'm going to hire McKinsey to do my strategy, and that's going to be a much more costly application. And so we look at these every day and we say, boy, that's a lot of money for what you're talking about. And that's where you and I, or the representative that serves your region, we would talk it out and say, this seems out of line with what we've seen in other places. Tell me more, explain why this is where it is. I think on the infrastructure projects, if you look at that breakdown, again, going back to the $100 million, if you just said 6 states divided by 100 million divided by 6 states, and if we said Illinois is sort of the biggest state, maybe we'd look at $20 million. And now I'm talking to CMAP, which is a region of, I think, 7 counties, maybe a few more. But there are another 80 some counties or 70 some counties down there in downstate Illinois that have COVID impacts and certainly need our assistance too. So if we were to get into the larger grant amounts for us, $3-4 million from EDA, that money starts to go very quickly. So I think our typical grant size in the past few years has been in the $2 million range. I guess I don't want anyone to walk away from this and say, well, he said 2 million. I've got a $4 million project. See you later. I guess I'm always interested in hearing more about what those projects are. And it goes again back to that competitiveness calculation. If someone came to me with a $4 million project that just hit all of our investment priorities, had massive job creation, had some relation to the COVID pandemic itself, that's certainly a conversation I'd be interested in having. I think where the project is a little bit farther afield from where we normally are, maybe we don't see that job creation benefit, maybe we don't see the kinds of economic impact, then I'm not shy about saying this is really outside what would be a competitive range for a particular project. I'm gonna flip to the next question. From a park and recreation agency. So again, the question is framed, are we an eligible entity? Certainly eligible. Park districts are always special purpose units of government, certainly can apply. When we start to think about where EDA is though, given what I've discussed today, job creation, the creation of private investment in communities, parks are really in that community development realm. This is what people use to see that as, as strictly within EDA's wheelhouse. And so I would go back and say you're certainly eligible. Whether that's competitive, I'm not so sure. But certainly happy to discuss that with you in greater detail if you have a need. So the next question, you mentioned reviewing a project before we apply. We have a couple projects under consideration. How can we consult with EDA on what might be a good project? It's really just an email to me. It's a very hands-on agency. And so if you emailed me And I guess I always want to see maybe a couple pieces of paper on what the project is. Generally, who is the applicant? What do you want to do with the funding? What's the total amount? And kind of what are the expected outcomes? That's a baseline for me to understand, is this a conversation that should continue? Is this going to be competitive? Is it something that we should really try to track down? For non-construction awards, those are usually conversations around a scope of work. So when we think about a scope of work, it's always sort of these ing verbs. What are you going to do with that money for 40 hours a week? So you're going to have a budget that says, I need $100,000 to study this industrial corridor and figure out what it is. Okay, what does that actually look like? What are you going to spend your time on doing? Well, it's going to be some researching. It's going to be coordinating stakeholders. It's going to be some GIS mapping. It's going to be all these ing words that help us understand what you're spending the money on. And then who's going to do it? So is it going to be a contractor that's going to be competitively bid? Is it going to be your own personnel at the organization? And then finally, what is the rest of the budget? Are you going to spend this on indirect costs or overhead? Is there going to be some combination of personnel and contractors? Is there any, for example, printing costs in the past were something that we always considered. But like I said, it's a couple pieces of paper, just an attachment to an email that says, hey, I've got this idea. Let me know what you think. And I do it all day long. So it's not hard for me to say, this just doesn't look competitive. And if I say that, it doesn't really mean that you can't apply. I'm certainly happy to help you go down that road. I'm really just here providing technical assistance about the program and trying to help people just understand where they stand with respect to our programs. So send me an email. I think my contact information is on the last slide, or certainly CMAP and DCEO, or I can make that available to you after the presentation. Next question. Due to COVID-19, we were unable to make necessary repairs for expanded use of our community center. Is this a viable request for assistance? I think that's tough because, number one, the community center really isn't in that job creation vein. I certainly understand the value of a community center, especially around all the things that go on there. Access to public health care, access to education services, access to lots of different things that you need from a community center. But I think when you look at just what I've described today are just ongoing focus on job creation and private investment directly tied to our assistance. Community center haven't been something that we've typically funded in the past. And I think going forward, just with the competitiveness that we're going to see from the applications, we're going to probably stay pretty close to where we normally are with this funding from the CARES Act. One thing that you did raise in that question, though, it relates to repairs. So we never want to be in a situation where the water treatment plant is not pumping water because we just haven't had the money to fix it. Where we want to be is there is some job creation element of this. We need expansion of this treatment plant, or we have infrastructure that is so broke down that no one is going to locate here to create jobs. Where we see communities that are under orders from the State Department of Environmental Quality, that always makes us a little nervous because it's not an economic development project, it's more of an environmental remediation project. So I think when you think about these things, you're always characterizing it as, how does this relate to increasing economic activity, increasing job creation in that community? Next question, can CDBG be used as the share? So yes, in almost all circumstances. The one place where we do not allow CDBG funds as local share for our grants is in revolving loan funds. And the reason for that is because not only EDA's funding, but also CDBG funding never loses its federal character. So I won't tell you who the community was, but we gave them a revolving loan fund award back in the 80s. And their match for that award was CDBG. Fast forward about 30 years, and there had been some mismanagement of the RLF. They had not done accounting. There had been some theft. They had had some bad loans that were not properly underwritten. And so now they're saying, new leadership in that community came in and said, we got to get out of this. We don't have the capacity to run this anymore. And there had been so many losses that we were unable to determine what was EDA's funding and what was CDBG's funding. And both of the agencies wanted that money back. And it was a mess. So we don't accept CDBG as match for RLF, but we do accept it for anything else. Okay, I think that's all the questions we have right now. I did want to spend time on the next slide just for a few minutes. It relates to these opportunity zones. So I think when you're thinking about all the tools at your disposal, opportunity zones, I think, came out back in 2018. Some of the rules were finalized in 2019, and there was a lot of press around what is the value of these opportunity zones. And so if you have opportunity zones in your community, number one, they are an investment priority for EDA. So where we can fund investment in opportunity zones, we're interested in that. What we find, though, related to opportunity zones is so often they're residential developments. We see multi-tenant residential in opportunity zones as some of the kind of most likely uses of those zones, and that's just not where EDA is. But I think if you have opportunity zones, it's something to keep in mind, because that is a competitiveness factor for us. And if we're doing something that is typically within what EDA does within that opportunity zone, then that can make it a little bit more competitive for us. And it's just good business. Who doesn't want, what job creator doesn't want some limitation on their capital gains exposure? We have another question. A mixed use building with affordable housing, retail, and business development. The problem with mixed use is it does have that residential character. And again, so often it goes to the kinds of community development and activities that are just not really where EDA is. So when we think about retail, there's so much retail out there. We could be funding ring roads around shopping malls. We could be funding downtown mixed use development. We could be funding affordable housing for seniors and for other people in the community. I think it's very difficult for us to get out there when there is an entire agency, Housing and Urban Development, that refers to those kinds of needs. So I think that in terms of competitiveness, very difficult for us to consider. Certainly not investment in the building itself, because that's going to be owned by a for-profit. None of our infrastructure can ever be owned by a for-profit. I think some of the places where we see success with mixed use is a larger development that includes both the kinds of building that you're talking about, some residential, some retail, some commercial, but that's only a piece of the larger project, which also includes industrial activity or commercial activity, things like that. And again, it's just very difficult to count the jobs on residential developments, and mixed use gets wrapped up in that as well. So probably not a super competitive type of activity for us to fund, but a good question. Certainly get that question a lot of times when we speak to organizations. Examples of recently funded projects, especially within the Department of Transportation. So Department of Transportation is a separate entity, and I think that with respect to economic development, I think that the program that comes to mind are some of those Tiger grants that came out years ago under the Recovery Act. I'm not familiar with Department of Transportation projects. Jonathan, maybe some familiarity with Illinois Department of Transportation projects. But where we come in really is not just the justification for us is not, well, we have to redo this turn lane because we're seeing too many accidents per year. Pretty strictly safety focused, or we need to redo this road to widen it to add additional flow of cars. Again, we're not the traffic management agency. Where we see investment in roads and transportation relates again right back to that job creation element. So we have an industrial area, the roads are not fit for 80,000 pound truck traffic. We need to upgrade them to serve the freight and industrial activity that's going around this area. That's something that we've done in the past. We need to add additional turn lanes to make sure that trucks can get in and out, facilitating commerce. Again, the idea of jobs being related to our investments. Trying to think of other examples of specifically transportation. Certainly, building out infrastructure for industrial areas. I think the challenge there is, especially in Chicagoland, so many of these industrial areas, if we were to open up space in an industrial area, it would be owned by a private developer. And the challenge there is, if we have a private developer owning this land, as a taxpayer, I think I would have some discomfort with federal funding going to help a private developer develop his or her parcels for sale. That just seems like a pass-through. So we typically stay away from infrastructure that supports developer-owned property. Where we have a mix of ownership, that can make it a little bit better. So it's not 100 acres owned by one developer. It's many smaller parcels owned by many different entities that maybe has a mind to be developed industrially for the community. That's something we can consider. I want to offer answer to another question here. Referencing specifically the notice of funding opportunity, which you can get on grants.gov or you can get on our website. It mentions the deployment of broadband for purposes including supporting telehealth and remote learning for job skills as an example of a project that could potentially be funded. Is this referring narrowly to constructing the broadband infrastructure itself, or could that potentially include projects that can help connect more community residents to existing broadband options and technology solutions for the purposes of job training and workforce development and remote learning? So talking about broadband, we're very interested in broadband. It is very difficult. A couple different reasons. So going back to that ownership, it's not every day that we see a not-for-profit or a municipally owned broadband service. Even when we have seen municipally owned broadband service providers, typically there's some for-profit entity that is taking the user fees from the users. And so we're interested in broadband, but we have not been able to find very many projects that fit within the rules. The other thing that's challenging about broadband is it's many, many, many miles of wire that is laid across many different property owners' property. And so typically people will come and say, okay, I want to do a broadband project. And we'll say, okay, do you have easements to all the land where the project is going to be, where the fiber is going to be laid? No. Okay, how many property owners are we talking about? Several hundred. Scary. Because again, we have to check, if you do a project with EDA, if an award is made, we'd go through an entire title search on that property. So anywhere EDA infrastructure is put, we make sure that the title owner is our applicant or that there's some easement to our applicant. So two different challenges there. Number one, the for-profit element always kind of muddies the waters for us and makes us very nervous. Number two, the property ownership where the fiber is going to be laid can be very difficult too, just from a, well, I'm not going to do this broadband until you give me the award, and I can't get the easements until I get the award, but we're saying you need to have the easements at least 99.9% tightened up before we make the award. And I just find a lot of communities and broadband projects founder on those requirements. We certainly would never provide assistance to run the broadband. We would be able, in these very limited circumstances, where all the questions checked out for us, to be able to provide broadband infrastructure. It's just something that everybody says, well, I want broadband. And then when they start to dig into the very dense rules we have around ownership and operation of broadband services, they find that we're not there for them in that way. And it's something that I would be more apologetic for that if it didn't go to some of the core considerations that we have related to property ownership and related to only providing assistance to nonprofits. Those two things are just central to our programming, and they're often not in line with people's vision for broadband in their communities. Okay. So I think that was the last question. We have just a few minutes more. Jonathan, go ahead and offer whatever you have.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say I could nowhere have near done a more thorough job than you, Dennis, and really appreciate you diving deep into what the EDA does, what the perfect project really looks like, what's allowed, what's not allowed. And, I think everyone here, was familiar with the program, but they even have a better understanding of how they could potentially take advantage of these funds. What's a safe project, what's not a safe project. But did just want to pitch, the Regional Economic Development team at DCEO. We are here to support you as best as possible. CMAP is here as well. And of course, if there's any nuanced questions, I'm sure Dennis is also. Also just wanted to pitch to everyone on the call. Tomorrow, DCEO opens up our business interruption grants. And so for any businesses that have been impacted by COVID-19, we encourage you, if you haven't received funds, to look into those funds to see if you're eligible. The other piece I want to share is our Rebuild Illinois grants. We still have our rolling shovel ready, as well as our public infrastructure that's due on June 30th. And again, these are funds that could be used as a match for Dennis's program. And then, of course, last but not least, we have our Disinvested impacted areas, 20 million in grants for businesses that experience property damage. But just appreciate everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Jane. Thank you, Simone, and thank you, Austin, for really organizing this. And thank you to the 100+ folks that joined us over the hour. I encourage you all to really look at this program and see, how it could potentially benefit Illinois. I know we're competing with other states, and my idea was, how can we make sure we get as many dollars here in Illinois? So with that being said, Dennis, is this PowerPoint able to be shared?
Sure. I just want to take a second. Thank you again, Jonathan, and thank CMAP and DCEO for giving us the ability to reach you all and to get the word out about these funds.
Awesome. So after that, we're done, and it's a wrap. So thanks, Dennis. Thanks, Jane. Thanks, everyone else. I also want to pitch my regional development manager, Manny Lopez, for helping to coordinate this as well. I'll drop his information in the chat, and I'm sure we'll be doing some type of follow-up. So we'll make sure we have information there.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
We'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.